Good morning, Central Kentucky. This is Sandra Leslie White coming to you live from WJMM Studios here, just outside Lexington, Kentucky, shouting out to all of you around the country on WJMM.com and Facebook. Those of you listening in were able to listen to the intro by casting crowns east to the west, and we are going to talk about that today in the context of Hosea chapter 5 and Psalm 103 to understand just exactly how far it is from the east to the west. Have you ever thought about that? Well, apparently if you go to as far as the north, if you go as far north at the top of the North Pole, you would then have to start going south. This is the point where north and south meet. However, if you start going east and never turn around, you will always go east. The same is true with west. So how far is it from the east to the west? And what do the scriptures have to say about that? Well, we're in Hosea chapter 5. We're still on verse 1. And talking a little bit more specifically about this verse before we move on into the rest of the chapter. So let's go there today in the New American Standard Version. Hosea chapter 5 verse 1 says this: "Hear this, O priests, give heed, O house of Israel. Listen, O house of the king, for the judgment applies to you. For you have been a snare at Mizpah and a net spread out on Tabor." All right, if you're just tuning in, this is Sandra Leslie White talking about east to the west. How far is it from the east to the west? And is there significance in this particular verse as we move on to understanding what was happening to Israel, the northern kingdom, in the latter part of the 8th century BC when this prophecy was penned? We know that judgment is upon the nation of Israel, that there seems to have been plenty of time for them to respond to the powerful love of God, as we saw in chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 of Hosea. We know that he is continuously wooing his people and warning his people and wanting his people to follow him, to love him beyond any other love on the planet, to not just worship him simply because he wants to be. That's just kind of a strange sort of theological position. He wants to be in a relationship with us so that we can live this life on the planet that he planned for us long ago. Before the foundations of the world, the scriptures say, his plan was for us to walk in. And to walk into the goodness of God on the earth. And then to draw other people into his goodness. And yet we look at our planet today. We look at our country today. Maybe your community, even your church. And you wonder where the goodness of God is. Well, let's talk about this. Hosea chapter 5 verse 1 is a real indictment, is it not, on 3 areas within this kingdom of Israel on the earth, this northern kingdom. The pulpit commentary said this, it talks about verse 1, "Hear ye this, O priests, and hearken ye house of Israel, give an ear, O house of the king." They say this: the persons here addressed comprise all the estates of the realm: priest, people, and princes. The house of Israel is the northern kingdom, and the house of the king is the members of the king's family, of his court, of his government. Thus the rulers and the ruled, the spiritual teachers and the taught are comprehended in this address. Neither priestly office, nor popular power, nor princely dignity was to be exempted, But though all are summoned to give audience, the heads of the people, the men of light and leading, are first arraigned. For judgment is toward you, as the clause is correctly rendered, not it devolves on you to maintain judgment, as some understand it. It had indeed been the province of the priest to teach, and of the king to execute the judgments of God in Israel, but now they are themselves the subjects of judgment. Judgment was now to begin at the house of the king and of the priest. God was about to execute judgment upon them, the judgment from that judgment seat where justice never miscarries and where no mistake is ever made. The cause of this is assigned, because ye had been a snare on Mizpah and a net spread upon Tabor. Instead of being safeguards of the people, they had been a snare to them. Instead of being true leaders, as God had intended them, they had misled them. Instead of contributing to their security, they had seduced them to sin and so helped prepare them for destruction. They had been a snare to entrap and a net to entangle. East as well as west of the Jordan, their evil influence had wrought ruin. Mizpah, now Esau, was on the east of the river among the hills of Gilead, where Jacob and Laban entered into covenant. Tabor, like a solitary cone or sugar loaf, rises up from the plain of Jezreel, or Esdraelon, on the west of the river. On the wooded slopes of Tabor and the beacon hill of Mizpah, game, no doubt, abounded and found covert, and hence the origin of the figure here used. But they had probably become scenes of idolatry or wickedness. Okay, if you're just joining in, this is the pulpit commentary on Hosea 5:1, talking today about east to west. So the reason for that is we're looking just at this geographical positioning of two high places on either side of the Jordan. We're talking about Mizpah, now Esau, on the east among the hills of Gilead, and Tabor, and like this solitary cone, must have been a very high and interestingly shaped, or sugar loaf, it says, shaped, cone-like mountainous region, rises up from the plain of Jezreel, and that is on the west of the river. So from east to the west, to the two high places. And we've talked about high places. We talked about the fact that God's people were being influenced by the idolatrous worship of pagan gods, particularly the temple prostitutes, both male and female, one of whom scholars tend to think Hosea, this holy prophet, married, and her name was Gomer. We don't hear about Gomer in chapter 4 and leading into chapter 5, but she is always there, and we'll return to her and her story. But the fact of the matter is that these were two geographical regions, and these were historically correct, that Mizpah and Tabor were on the east and west of the Jordan, and both had become idolatrous places of worship and wickedness. And when we talk about wickedness, we've talked about this before in previous shows. You can look at those shows on my Facebook page, Sandra Leslie White Ministries. All my shows are archived there, or you can check out my podcast on Podbean, Lifting the Veil. But I've done a teaching, extensive teaching, and we learned about a lot of what was going on these high places in chapter 4. So some of the worst is that the men were committing not only idolatrous worship up there, but they were sacrificing young girls and women, and they were taking their wives up there, or their brides, or daughters and daughters-in-law, and they were actually then taking them under the trees. In other words, they were in the shade, meaning the men were committing all kinds of perverse acts, not with their family, it seems, but with the temple prostitutes under the shade of the trees. So it is as if there is very covert activity going on in terms of the worshiping and the outdoors, up on the high places where they could be close to their gods. Perhaps they were still thinking they could be closer to Yahweh there, but Yahweh is extremely close to them and aware of all of their activities, and he has had, it seems, enough. So at this juncture in Hosea 5, and if we back it up to just the last verse in Hosea 4:19, he said the wind wraps them in its wings. This is a rushing, violent wind that is essentially destructive in nature, and they will be ashamed because of their sacrifices. So they will be, this is prophetic, there will be at a time, they're not seemingly now, but they will be ashamed of their sacrifices. And then he goes on and starts out the 5th chapter and he'll get more specific then as we move on. But he's really calling out the leadership today. The priests, the people, the princes. So, as far as the east is to the west, and so this sort of leaves us hanging, I think. I think there's always these cliffhangers in Hosea. Because what is God going to do? I mean, we know Yahweh is this mighty, awesome, just God, but we also know him as love and the God of mercy and the God of righteous judgment and justice. And so what is going to happen? You know, we're going back and forth, aren't we? Between the love of God and the wooing of God, especially in chapter 2, then the sending out of Hosea to woo his own wife back in chapter 3. I mean, we're looking at now judgment. God just seems to have had enough. Well, let's look at Psalm 103:12 as we close today. And again, the intro to today's message I'll post on my Facebook page, East to West, from Casting Crowns. Listen to 103:12. This is a psalm of David, who understood this well. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Again, as far as the east is from the west, so far he has removed our transgressions from us. So David, who understood well his God, understood well his own sin, understood well his humanity, yet he was the picture of the coming Christ. That David's reign would rule forever. He was the predecessor of the invisible kingdom of Christ. So, wow, this is power-packed. But he makes the statement that as far as the east is from the west, which is endless, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. And in verse 13, just as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. That word, fear him, revere him, respect him, know him. So here we go, understanding the tension between heaven and earth, the tension between Yahweh and his people, and realizing that there is yet the story to unfold for his people, as awful as they were. What about for you and me? As awful as we have been, as far as we have been from God. How far? How far have we been? From the east to the west? Have we been on the Mount of Mizpah or the Mount of Tabor? Have we been there? And are we just not able to be saved? Well, hold on tight, because as far as the east is to the west, our transgressions have been removed for those who revere, who fear the Lord. I look forward to continuing this with you in the coming days. God bless you.